Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Emily. I'm with Telltale, and today we're going to be talking about an Edgar Allan Poe short story. I'm reviewing The Mystery of Marie Roget. Or Roget? I don't know how to pronounce her name because it's French. So for all we know, it's Marie Roget, because they like to not pronounce, letters and stuff. Anyway, so Greg and I are going to be doing a review of this guy. I'm just going to dive right into it because I actually didn't like this one. Yeah, shocking, I know. But I actually have a really hard time with mystery stories, mainly because I find them ridiculously predictable. And this was another one for me that was pretty predictable. There's going to be a lot of spoilers in here because I'm going to be like, I'm just going to tell you what's up. So the premise of the story is, it's actually a sequel to Murder in the Rue Morgue. Same characters kind of solving this case, but the premise is, young lady, perfume counter girl, goes missing for a little bit, randomly comes back, goes missing again, and then her body's found in the river. So, of course, first time she goes missing and then suddenly shows up again, my brain was like, secret lover. Because it's Paris during a fairly Victorian era. Of course, she has a secret lover. Most sexually repressed time for basically everyone. And I don't know if anybody else has ever been a perfume counter girl, but that was actually my very first job out of college. I worked at a retailer at the perfume counter. Oh my goodness. The amount of men who come over and flirt with you. I shit you not. This is not a stereotype. It is literally the way things happen. So, of course, this poor girl is probably manipulated by some charming man to go and be her secret lover. So she has a fiance and her mother who live with her, and after she goes missing a second time and doesn't come back, they're freaking out. Her body's found in the river. Newspapers are writing speculations like crazy about things that are being found and evidence that's kind of turning up, but it's turning up at weird times. There's a lot of speculation about the evidence, and I mean, it's kind of one of those very stereotypical Parisian mystery kind of things. It's not anything spectacular. There's really no weird twist. At one point, a newspaper mentions that she had been seeing this corporal who shall rename, or some kind of military person who shall remain nameless throughout the entire story because, they didn't want to ruin his reputation or whatever, because it was all speculation. And the second that newspaper briefly mentions that individual, I'm like, he did it. Duh. Secret lover. She probably was like, nah, I'm gonna marry this other guy. Told him so. He killed her and threw her body in the river. Like, that was really all it was. So, I mean, it's Paris. You don't need a lot of world building for Paris, so that was a little disappointing. There really is no super twist. The second you find out that there's this other gentleman in her life, you're just kind of like, yeah. And one of the other biggest key things was when they found her in the river, a lot of her clothing was used to bind her up in a manner that appeared to be either strangulation or something like that. But it was really intimate pieces of clothing that were tied up to her. So it was someone who was familiar with those intimate pieces of clothing, secret lover or female, who knew that, how petticoats worked and how the hems worked and things like that. So it was just ridiculously predictable for me. I didn't have a lot of intrigue, the explanations and deductions about why the speculations of the newspapers was a huge, like, why the newspapers were wrong, was a huge part of this short story. In fact, it was probably 2/3 of the story. It spends time explaining why the newspapers are wrong, explaining why the fiancé is innocent, and explaining why, you know, these other things that are coming to light that were other newspaper stories just kind of met with this particular mystery. Because at one point in the story, somebody comes forward with all these different newspaper articles that seem to be unrelated. But once you think about, oh, we have this officer of, you know, some type who's in the Navy, it kind of is like, oh, suddenly this boat shows up that's been missing. Oh, the sailor's knot that was, you know, on the victim's petticoat that was around her throat. Yeah, definitely, definitely big indicators. But yeah, it was just kind of disappointing because, I mean, Murder in the Rue Morgue is kind of a really interesting story, and then it just follows up with this one where it's like, meh. Typical Victorian scandal mystery. So I was a little disappointed in this one. I do have a really pretty copy of Edgar Allan Poe's work, and I have this really beautiful woodcut for this one that I wanted to show everybody. That was gorgeous. But yeah, it just was kind of, and maybe it's because I used to be a perfume counter girl, I kind of know how these things go. Like, there's always the stereotype that perfume counter girls tend to be really edgy and scandalous, and they tend to be flirted with a lot by men. It's true. I'm edgy and scandalous. No, I'm kidding. But yes, men do come over and they say some disgusting things. I don't even want to start. But telling you some of the creepy things dudes have told me while I worked at a perfume counter. But then there's always the occasional gentleman who is definitely flirting with you in a very charming way. So I can understand how this poor girl was, you know, lured away from her very conventional life, and from her lover, things like that. Especially because she's pretty young. Like, she's teenage, like, of age, but kind of, you know, back then, Victorian era, of age could be anywhere from like 15 to 20, basically. So just, I was a little disappointed by this one. Edgar Allan Poe is usually one of my go-tos, but I'm not as familiar with this particular piece of work. I'm not sure that anybody else really knew that Murder in the Rue Morgue had a sequel, or a continuation of the adventures of. But I certainly didn't. So that was kind of a pleasant surprise to know that some of the classic Edgar Allan Poe tales definitely have continuations to them. So that was kind of cool. And then, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend this one. It's just ridiculously predictable, and very conventional. I expected more from Edgar Allan Poe, unfortunately. But I mean, it's a fun little piecing things together story if you're into that kind of thing. But like I said, I am not a mystery person. I piece things together too soon, and then I end up being like, oh, I was right, there's no twist, there's nothing spectacular going on here, come on, really? But yeah, so I do have a quote from this one that I really liked. Let me pull that up real quick before I get too far. Oh, where did it go? Here it is. It's just a really short phrase. It says, "With God, all is now." And this is just kind of talking about God. Basically, it's kind of like, hard to describe. So this particular part of the work is when they've kind of concluded, it's the wrapping up of all these deductions about why, who's actually guilty for this murder. And so it's kind of coming back to God knows all, God knows what's happened kind of thing. And with God, all is now. It was just a really powerful statement. I think it was kind of a really good culmination, all-encompassing, they couldn't have gotten away with this. So yeah, it's very, very, very powerful stuff. So I did like that. But yeah, if you like mysteries, I guess, this is probably pretty good for some people, but I found it ridiculously predictable, so I can't say I recommend it. I like Murder in the Rue Morgue better as it stands alone. That's just me. I know, shocking. Something I actually didn't like that much. But yeah, so that's me on that. Can't wait to hear what Greg thought. See you guys.
So Emily and I are both big Edgar Allan Poe fans. We love stories like The Black Cat and the Fall of the House of Usher and Telltale Heart, which we used as inspiration for the name of our video series and book series. And so I said, let's review an Edgar Allan Poe short story. And I let her pick one. And she came up with 3 that she couldn't decide between. All 3 of them were stories that I had never read before. The one I picked, because she had me pick from the 3, I picked The Mystery of Marie Roget. I had never read it before. Emily had never read it before. I had never read Murders in the Rue Morgue either. I read that just before reading Mystery of Marie Roget because I found out with a little research that the 2 are related. They have the same character, the Detective Dupin. And actually, the Purloined Letter is a 3rd in the series. Now, these stories are important for the fact that they were the beginnings of this kind of detective fiction. These stories led ultimately to characters like Sherlock Holmes and the Agatha Christie characters. Those kinds of detective stories using deduction to solve the mystery had their beginnings in these 3 stories by Edgar Allan Poe. So they're important stories for that aspect. Murders in the Rue Morgue, I thought, was a fairly good story, though I didn't think it was great. It didn't really excite me much. The Mystery of Marie Roget, even less so. Now, it has to be understood, Edgar Allan Poe was writing about an actual crime. It was committed in New York, not Paris. So he changed the location, probably just so that he could reuse his detective character from Murders in the Rue Morgue. But what he was doing is refuting the actual newspaper articles about this real life murder. So this is really a true crime story long before In Cold Blood. It's just he fictionalized it by moving to Paris and changing all the names and everything. So Edgar Allan Poe was attempting to refute the findings of newspaper reporters about this case. And the story then is the detective spending the entire story talking about how these newspaper articles got it wrong and what really happened. And so Poe was solving the case, a real world case, through his fictional detective. And in that, he gets into a lot of nitpicky little details, and the story really bogs down. It's so far, I've been reading it in the Complete Tales of Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, and I started from the beginning with the Hans Pfaall story and read up to The Mystery of Marie Roget, which is about 200 pages of this book. And The Mystery of Marie Roget was just not very interesting. I do love Edgar Allan Poe's fiction. There's a couple of stories I just read that I never read before that I've fallen in love with, but not so far, not these. I've yet to read The Purloined Letter. I'm going to read that next just to be thorough, but not enjoying these detective stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah, I guess if you're a diehard Sherlock Holmes fan, you should at least read these three stories just to say you read them, and so that you understand better where detective fiction originated, because this is the origin of detective fiction. This is where it started. As far as I know, I'm not aware of anybody before this that wrote this kind of story. One thing that did interest me about both stories involve murders, and the murders were pretty gruesome. And Poe went into a lot of detail, the kind of detail I would expect from books today with murder stories, because we've got movies of people being, totally cut apart and stuff. I didn't expect it from a story written way back in the 1840s. I kind of expected a lot less gory detail, but Poe went for it. He held nothing back. He described how the woman's head in Murders of the Rue Morgue was cut almost all the way through, and he described the corpse of Marie Roget pretty completely, which I found surprising, and I think for its day was probably very shocking to a lot of people. So these stories are important, but not the most enjoyable read. I've read better. And so with that, see you next week.